A scarred Pitbull stood still behind a glass door, silent but staring. As a man he hadn't seen in years knelt outside, holding a worn leather collar and whispering, "I think I used to be his person." That's how this story begins, and how your heart just might break before it heals. Welcome to Veil Marks, where we tell the kind of stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. This video holds a powerful message about loyalty, memory, and the unshakable bond between a man and his dog. Watch until the very end. The ending will stay with you forever. At the edge of a quiet town tucked between two rolling hills, there stood a modest animal shelter that most people passed by without a second glance. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where the air held the scent of hay, antiseptic, and a faint trace of longing. Inside, beyond a plain white door with a chime that barely rang anymore, was a hallway. Long, narrow, and lined with numbered rooms, each one home to a dog waiting for a second chance. Some barked excitedly when someone approached, tails wagging wildly. Others jumped against the bars of their kennel, eager to be seen, to be chosen. But then, there was Bruno. Room 7, the third door on the left. Bruno didn't bark. He never jumped. He didn't pace like the anxious or wag like the hopeful. He simply sat, still and watchful, his gray-muzzled face turned toward the glass pane of the door, as though waiting for something, or someone, who never came. He was a large, aging pit bull with a broad chest and weathered scars across his left shoulder. His fur, once jet black, had faded to a dusty charcoal, and his eyes were a cloudy amber gray, always alert, yet distant. Most visitors passed by his room quickly, sometimes lingering only long enough to murmur, "He looks mean," before moving on to the puppies or fluffier breeds in the next rooms. And every time someone stopped, even for just a few seconds, Bruno would let out a sound, a soft, low whine, barely audible unless you were truly listening. It wasn't the kind of sound that begged. It wasn't a cry either. It was quieter than that, gentler, almost like the air shifting under a whisper, a sound that brushed the edge of memory. Maggie, one of the longest-serving staff members at the shelter, was the only one who noticed. She began calling it the whisper behind the door. At first, it unsettled her. She remembered the first time she heard it. She had been making her rounds, clipboard in hand, when a couple paused outside Bruno's door. The man had squinted at Bruno through the glass. The woman had wrinkled her nose. They turned away almost immediately. That was when Bruno let out that strange, heartbreaking whine, so quiet she thought she'd imagined it. But over time it became a pattern. Every single time a person paused outside his room, Bruno would do it again. That same whisper-soft sound. Never when someone passed by quickly. Never for staff. Only when there was that brief hesitation, as if he could sense hope on the other side and then feel it slip away. It didn't take long before Maggie started noticing more about him. The way he always positioned himself, sitting facing the door, never sleeping during visitor hours. The way his eyes followed feet, not faces, as they walked past. The way, when no one stopped at all, he would eventually turn his head slowly and face the far corner of the room, as though refusing to look at the world anymore that day. Bruno had been at the shelter longer than any other dog. 3 years, 9 months, and 12 days to be exact. Maggie kept count, though she never said it out loud. No one adopted older pit bulls with scars and cloudy eyes. No matter how gentle he was, no matter that he never growled, never barked, and never caused any trouble. People were afraid of what he looked like, not who he was. Sometimes Maggie would bring her folding chair and sit quietly outside Bruno's room during her break. She'd sip her coffee and read, but her ears always tuned in for that whisper. On the days when no one came at all, she'd go in, sit cross-legged on the floor beside him, and stroke his back gently. Bruno would lean into her touch, never making a sound. "I don't think he's waiting to be adopted," she said once to another staff member. "I think he's waiting for someone in particular, someone he knew." The other staffer shrugged. Maybe, or maybe he's just given up. But Maggie didn't believe that. Dogs like Bruno didn't give up. They just grew quiet, like people who had waited too long for an answer that never came. There was something haunting about the way Bruno kept vigil at that door. It wasn't desperation, it was devotion, as if he had made a promise, silently, long ago, and was still keeping it, day after day, without knowing why. Visitors came and went, rain fell, snow dusted the roof, seasons changed, puppies were adopted, new dogs arrived, but Bruno remained, unmoving, waiting, and the whispers never stopped. Each time Maggie heard it, it tugged at something inside her chest. She didn't know why it affected her so deeply. Maybe it was because her father had once served as a firefighter. Maybe it was because she'd grown up with a big old mutt who used to sleep by her bedroom door, loyal until the very end. Maybe it was because she saw in Bruno something she couldn't quite name. A grief that had settled so long ago it had turned into silence. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Bruno's wait was not in vain, not entirely. Because one quiet morning, as the frost clung to the shelter windows and the hallway remained hushed, the chime above the entrance door rang, and a man stepped inside. He didn't look around, he didn't speak. He simply walked down the hallway and stopped outside room 7. There was something about Bruno that made people pause, and then quietly step away. It wasn't that he barked or lunged at the glass. In fact, he rarely moved at all when strangers approached. But it was his size, his stature, the way his shadow seemed to stretch further than the others in the softly lit hallway. And of course, the scars. Bruno's coat was a faded silver gray now, a color dulled by time and sorrow. It clung tightly to his thick frame, revealing the ripple of muscle beneath, a silent reminder that he hadn't always been confined behind a kennel door. A long scar curved along his left shoulder, another smaller one traced beneath his right eye, evidence of a life that had known struggle and survival. To the unknowing eye, he looked like trouble. To many, he looked like a dog with a past better left unexplored. Too intimidating, they would say, almost apologetically, as they turned their attention to the younger dogs wagging their tails eagerly across the hall. Some would flinch when Bruno's amber eyes met theirs through the glass, mistaking the stillness in his gaze for threat rather than weariness. It was a silent form of rejection. Again, and again, and again. Small, fluffy terriers, excitable beagles, golden retriever puppies with floppy ears and bouncing paws. Those were the ones who charmed families within minutes. Children giggled as they pressed their faces against the glass of those kennels, pointing, laughing, squealing. Couples shared smiles, nodding in instant agreement. "This one," they would say, "is perfect." But when it came to Bruno, the hallway would often fall quiet. He never made a scene. He didn't whimper or plead for attention. He simply stood there, tall and steady, eyes watching without expectation. And that, perhaps, was what unsettled people the most. There was something haunting about a dog that didn't even try anymore. Maggie had seen it more times than she could count. In her years working at the shelter, she'd come to understand how powerful a first impression could be, especially when it came to dogs. The majority of people who walked through those shelter doors wanted to fall in love instantly. They wanted a sweet face, a soft coat, an eager spirit. They wanted something that felt like a clean slate. Bruno, with his scarred body and battle-worn stillness, reminded people that love sometimes required patience, and that not every heart came unbroken. But Maggie saw what the others didn't. She saw the way Bruno would lower his head ever so slightly whenever a child walked past, as if trying to appear smaller, less frightening. She saw the gentleness in his eyes when she fed him each morning, how he never snatched food, always waited until her hand was completely clear before taking his first bite. She felt the warmth in the soft lick he'd give her hand after meals, a silent gesture that never failed to make her smile. She had once come in early to find Bruno curled up beside an aging golden retriever who had fallen ill. Somehow, he had managed to unlock the inner gate separating their rooms, something no other dog had done. He didn't cause harm or chaos. He simply laid beside her all night, as if keeping her company through the worst of it. When Maggie told the story to the other staff, someone had scoffed. "He's a pit bull. Must have been trained for something rough. Maybe it's just instinct." But Maggie shook her head. "That's not instinct. That's heart." She couldn't count the number of times she had watched people look into Bruno's eyes and walk away. At first, she tried to explain, telling visitors that he was calm, that he'd never so much as growled at anyone. But most already had their minds made up before she opened her mouth. Eventually, she stopped trying to persuade them. Instead, she focused on Bruno himself, giving him the kind of attention no one else seemed willing to offer. A scratch behind the ear when she passed his room. A few extra minutes of brushing. Soft words, spoken like secrets, even when she wasn't sure if he still believed in voices. One afternoon, as she cleaned out a nearby kennel, she watched yet another couple linger in front of Bruno's door. They leaned in, squinting through the glass. Bruno looked back, unmoving. His eyes met theirs, and for a brief second, there was stillness on both sides. Then, as if struck by some invisible chord, the couple turned and walked away. Bruno turned too, slowly, quietly, and faced the far wall. That was when Maggie said it, half to herself, half to the air. "Maybe he's whispering something only the right person will ever hear." It wasn't a joke, not really. More like a hope wrapped in a fragile truth. She liked to imagine that Bruno still believed someone out there remembered him, that he wasn't just waiting for a home, but for the home, for the one soul that wouldn't flinch at his face or his silence, for the person who would look past the surface and say, without hesitation, "There you are, I've been looking for you." But for now, he remained behind the door, an old soldier standing watch, not growling, not barking, just whispering and waiting. The shelter was unusually quiet that night. Winter had dropped a heavy silence over the building, muffling even the occasional shuffle of paws or the metallic clink of food bowls. Snow tapped softly against the windows, and the only light came from the flickering hallway bulbs left on for the dogs. Maggie stayed late, as she often did on nights like this, when the wind howled outside and the world felt too cold for anyone to be left alone. She moved through the halls with practiced ease, checking the locks, replenishing water bowls, whispering good nights to the dogs who still waited behind their doors. But as she passed room 7, her steps slowed. Bruno was sitting in his usual place, facing the glass, still as a statue. There was no movement, no acknowledgement. He didn't react to her presence at all. Then it came, that soft, low whine. It startled her, not because of its volume, but because it wasn't meant for her. The hallway was empty. No visitors, no one standing outside his door. Just Maggie and the silence. Yet still, Bruno whispered. Her chest tightened. For all the months she'd worked at the shelter, she had never heard that sound when no one else was around. It had always been reserved for strangers, brief pauses filled with unspoken longing. But tonight was different. Tonight, the whisper wasn't for someone standing in front of the glass. It was for someone lost in memory. She stood there for a long while, watching him. "Who are you waiting for, Bruno?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a breath. He didn't answer, of course. But the weight in his posture, the distant pull in his eyes, it told her enough. Later, as the night deepened and frost curled along the edges of the window panes, Maggie found herself drawn to the old metal filing cabinet tucked away in the corner of the staff room. It was a clunky thing, often ignored and gathering dust, but it held the intake records for every dog that had passed through the shelter in the last decade. She flipped through the folders, fingertips numb from the cold, until she found it. Bruno, ID number 11704. His photo paperclipped to the front, a younger, more vibrant version of the dog she now knew. In the image, Bruno was standing tall, ears alert, tongue out in a mid-pant, his coat a glossier black. But what caught Maggie's eye wasn't the dog. It was the uniformed figure beside him, a firefighter, kneeling with one hand resting proudly on Bruno's shoulder, both of them looking directly at the camera. She turned the page. Former K-9 Unit, Fire Department Certified Search and Rescue. Handler, Lieutenant Mark H. Dawson. There were brief notes, medical history, temperament assessments, dates of service. But what chilled Maggie most was the final entry. Brought in by third party, no contact left for previous owner, no follow-up requested. That was it. No mention of retirement, no forwarding address, no signature, just a goodbye that never really happened. Maggie sat back in her chair, the folder resting in her lap. It didn't make sense. K-9 dogs didn't just get dropped off like strays. They were heroes, partners, family. She kept reading, hoping for more. A scanned report, barely legible, described a mission where Bruno and Lieutenant Dawson had been dispatched to a burning apartment complex. A child had been trapped on the third floor. Visibility was near zero. Bruno had led the team in, located the child, and then, after an explosion collapsed part of the stairwell, dragged an unconscious firefighter out through the rubble. Name of the rescued officer, Lieutenant M. H. Dawson. Bruno had saved his handler's life, and then, somehow, had been left behind. The betrayal sank like a stone in Maggie's stomach. She knew there could be reasons, tragedies, accidents, but none of them softened the image now burned into her mind. A dog who gave everything, waiting for a man who never returned. She stared again at the photograph. Mark had a kind face, young, determined. Someone who clearly cared for the dog at his side. So what had happened? Why had Bruno been forgotten? She didn't have those answers. But she knew what she could do. The next morning, Maggie printed the photo and tacked it on the corkboard above her desk, right in the middle, where she and the others would see it every day. She wrote a note beneath it in her neat handwriting. Waiting is never meaningless. Some promises take longer to keep. And beneath that, one word: Bruno. Over the next few weeks, she began telling his story to anyone who asked. Not the full version, she didn't want pity for him, but just enough to make people stop and see beyond the scars. He was a firefighter's dog, she'd say. A real hero. Most people would nod politely and still move on, but a few stayed longer than before. They lingered, looked into his eyes a little deeper, asked his name again, and though none of them took him home, Maggie believed that, in some small way, the world was beginning to remember Bruno, one whisper at a time. It was a quiet Thursday morning, the kind that slipped by without notice, clouds hanging low, no visitors scheduled, and the hum of the heater the only constant sound in the shelter. Maggie had just finished her first cup of lukewarm coffee when the front door chimed. She didn't look up right away. Deliveries were common, and sometimes locals dropped off blankets or food without a word. But something about the silence that followed made her pause. No bark, no footsteps, no conversation. Just stillness. She stepped out from behind the counter and peeked down the hallway. A man was standing there. He was tall, maybe mid-50s, wearing a worn flannel jacket and boots that had seen too many winters. In one hand, he held a faded canvas bag with frayed straps. His shoulders were slightly hunched, as if the weight of something invisible pressed them downward. He wasn't looking at anyone or anything, just the door to room 7. Bruno's room. Maggie's breath caught, but she didn't move right away. She watched. The man didn't tap the glass, didn't crouch to get a closer look. He simply stood there, motionless, eyes locked on the dog inside. Bruno, for once, didn't make a sound. No low whine, no whisper, no turning away toward the wall like he always did when the inevitable rejection came. He stood, completely still, and looked back at the man. There was something trembling in his gaze, not fear, not hope exactly, but recognition. His ears didn't twitch, but his stance shifted ever so slightly, like he was holding himself back from something he couldn't quite understand. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. Maggie wasn't sure. Time seemed to bend in that moment, stretching longer than it should have. She finally approached, heart drumming in her chest. "Excuse me, sir?" she said gently, careful not to startle him. The man blinked as if waking from a dream. Slowly, he turned to look at her. His face was lined with age and fatigue, but his eyes, light blue, tinged with something deeper, were the kind of eyes that had seen too much and said too little. There was a faint scar across his temple, half hidden by a few wisps of gray hair. His voice, when it came, was quiet and thick with something unspoken. "I think," he hesitated. "I think I used to be his person." Maggie stared at him, momentarily stunned. "You mean Bruno?" she asked, voice lower now. The man nodded once. "That's what you call him?" "That's his name here," she replied, her hand subconsciously tightening around the clipboard she carried. "He's been with us for a few years. No one's ever come looking." He exhaled, slow and shaky, like the words hurt just coming out. "I didn't know he was still alive." The hallway was silent, save for the muffled breathing of dogs and the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Maggie looked back at Bruno, who still hadn't moved from his spot. His eyes never left the man. She took a careful step forward. "Do you mind telling me more?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he lowered his bag to the floor and knelt down beside it, rummaging through until he pulled out a small, weathered photograph. He held it out to Maggie. She took it and stared. It was old, edges curled, colors fading, but unmistakable. Bruno, younger, darker, standing proudly next to a firefighter in full gear. His tail blurred in motion from excitement, mouth open mid-pant. The man beside him wore a uniform with the name Patch, Dawson. Maggie looked up slowly. "Mark Dawson?" He nodded again. "That was me. Still is, I guess." Her heart turned over. "He's been waiting," she said before she could stop herself. Mark's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left Bruno's. "I didn't mean to leave him," he said, barely a whisper now. "I couldn't help it. I was out of it for a long time. When I came back, everything was gone. I didn't even remember where they'd taken him." Bruno took a single step forward inside the room, breaking his stillness. Just one step, but enough to make Mark's breath hitch. "He remembers you," Maggie said quietly. Mark wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. "I didn't think he would. After all this time." They stood in silence for another moment, neither quite ready to move, both anchored by the invisible thread stretched across the glass between them and the waiting dog. Maggie gently touched his arm. "Would you like to go in?" Mark didn't answer with words. He simply looked through the glass again, hand resting over his heart. And Bruno, after years of stillness and whispers, was waiting, not just behind a door this time, but right on the other side of healing. The room was still. Bruno stood on the other side of the door, his eyes fixed on the man kneeling before him. Maggie stood nearby, watching the fragile moment unfold, her heart pulled in a dozen directions. She had never seen Bruno this way, alert, trembling, but not from fear. There was something deeper, older, beneath the surface, recognition, connection. The man let out a slow breath, as though he had been holding it for years. "My name is Mark Dawson," he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "I used to be a firefighter. Bruno he was my partner." He looked up at Maggie, and for the first time since he arrived, his eyes met hers. "We served together for nearly 5 years, search and rescue mostly, fires, collapsed buildings, sometimes flood zones. He wasn't just a working dog. He was my friend." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that carries weight. Maggie nodded slowly, her hands still clasped in front of her. "What happened?" she asked gently. Mark leaned back against the wall, his gaze distant. "It was about 6 years ago," he began. "We were called to a warehouse fire on the south side. There were reports of 2 kids trapped on the 2nd floor. The heat was bad, worse than anything I'd ever been in. I remember Bruno leading the way, barking to signal the location. We found one of the kids. I helped him out. Went back in for the second." His voice cracked, and he paused to gather himself. "I don't remember much after that. A beam fell. Hit me hard. They told me later that Bruno pulled me out, grabbed the back of my gear and dragged me out through the smoke, saved my life." Bruno didn't move, but his breathing had changed, slower, deeper, like he, too, was listening. "I went into a coma that night," Mark continued. "Was out for almost 11 months. When I woke up, I didn't know who I was. Couldn't remember my name, my job, anything. It was all just gone." He swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "My sister was the one who handled things. She told me later that Bruno was taken to a shelter because no one knew what else to do. She left a letter with the staff, told them I might come looking for him if I ever came back." Mark's eyes darkened. "But I didn't. Not right away. After I woke up, they moved me from one rehab center to another. Hospitals, memory clinics, halfway homes. The letter must have gotten lost in the shuffle." He reached into his bag and pulled out an old photo, the same one Maggie had seen in the file, and a worn leather collar with a faded metal tag. She recognized the name engraved on it immediately: Bruno. "I found this about 3 months ago," he said softly, holding it out in both hands. "Tucked inside an old box they gave me when I was finally discharged for good. Said it was from my personal effects. When I held it, it hit me like a freight train." He looked up again, voice trembling. I remembered his eyes first. Those gray eyes, like fog after rain. Then the fire. Then the weight of him leaning against me, like he always did after a long shift. It all came back. Maggie's throat tightened. "What did you do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Mark gave a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I started looking. I didn't even know where to begin. I visited every shelter in the county, some of them twice. I showed his photo, this collar. Most said they hadn't seen him or he'd already passed. I was about ready to give up." He looked at Bruno again, voice softer now. "And then I saw your website last week. You posted his picture under long-term residence. I knew him instantly. The eyes. You can't forget eyes like that." Bruno took a small step forward, his body tense but steady. "I wasn't just trying to find a dog," Mark continued, voice cracking. "I was trying to find the only piece of myself that still felt real. Everything else in my life. It's gone. My house, my job, most of my memory. But him? He never left me. Not really." Maggie felt tears sting at the corners of her eyes. She tried to speak but couldn't. Mark looked down, his hand still resting on the collar. "I never meant to leave him behind, and I know it's probably too late to fix any of it. But I had to come. I had to tell him I'm sorry." Silence settled over the room again, thick, emotional, but not uncomfortable. On the other side of the glass, Bruno's head tilted just slightly, his gaze never leaving Mark's face. "He remembers," Maggie whispered, finally finding her voice. "He's been waiting." Mark let out a broken laugh. "God, after all these years, I didn't think he would." "Dogs don't forget," she said. "Not when it matters." Mark stood slowly, gripping the collar tightly. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'd like to see him, if he'll let me." Maggie nodded, and in that moment she knew, for both man and dog, this wasn't just a reunion. It was redemption. The silence in the hallway had become sacred, heavy, but not oppressive. It was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around the moment and asked the world to pause, just for a little while. Bruno stood still behind the glass, his body rigid but alert, as if every fiber in him was trying to decide whether he was dreaming. Mark stood only feet away, hands trembling, collar clutched in his grip like a relic from another lifetime. Maggie had seen hundreds of reunions in her years at the shelter. Owners crying over pets they thought they'd lost forever. Children reuniting with strays who'd wandered off. Even the occasional military service member being greeted by a dog after a long deployment. But this was different. There was no fanfare, no tail wagging, no dramatic dash into open arms. Just stillness, weight, recognition, and something so old and deep that it didn't need words to explain itself. She took a slow breath and stepped forward, keys jangling lightly in her pocket. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked Mark softly. He nodded, eyes never leaving Bruno's. "I've been ready since the moment I remembered his name." Maggie placed her hand on the doorknob. Her fingers hovered there for a second, long enough for her to silently ask the universe to be gentle. Then she turned it. The latch clicked, and the door swung open with a soft creak. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Bruno took a step forward. Just one, then another. His paws moved slowly, cautiously, like the ground beneath him might disappear at any moment. His head was low, but his eyes never broke contact. There was no growl, no whimper, no wag of the tail, just that same solemn stare, the one that had haunted this hallway for years. Mark dropped to his knees without thinking, both hands still gripping the worn leather collar. He held it out in front of him, like an offering. "It's yours," he whispered, voice breaking. "You wore this every day." Bruno stopped just short of touching him. The air between them buzzed with something unspoken, too old for words, too raw for explanation. Then Bruno leaned forward. He didn't bark. He didn't sniff. He remembered. His nose touched the collar, and then, gently, slowly, his head brushed against Mark's trembling hand. A second later, he lifted his snout and gave the lightest, most deliberate lick to Mark's fingers. It was not the excited kiss of a puppy. It was something quieter, deeper, a gesture of forgiveness, of trust, of home. Mark gasped, and then the tears came. The collar dropped to the floor as he reached forward, his arms wrapping around Bruno's thick neck. Bruno didn't resist. He leaned in, his weight pressing into the man who had once been his world, then his ghost, and now, his answer. Mark buried his face into Bruno's fur, sobbing into the warmth of a memory he never thought he'd feel again. "I'm so sorry," he choked. "I should have been there. I should have come sooner. I didn't forget you. I forgot myself." Bruno's only reply was to stay, solid, present, breathing in sync with the man who had once fought fires with him, who he had dragged from flames, who he had waited for every single day since. Maggie had stepped back, but now she couldn't hold it in. The tears ran down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. She covered her mouth with her hand, her heart thudding with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Then, as if guided by something beyond her control, a realization hit her. A memory. a face from long ago, the smell of smoke, the heat of panic, being carried in strong arms, and beside her a dark dog with bright eyes and a steady, calming presence. She had been only 8 years old, and she had been rescued from a burning apartment by a firefighter and his K-9 partner, by Mark and Bruno. Her knees nearly buckled at the weight of it. She staggered back against the wall, the past rushing in like a tide she hadn't known she was waiting for. It hadn't just been a coincidence. It had been full circle. Bruno and Mark hadn't just found each other. They had found her too, all three of them, bound by an event none of them could forget, even if they hadn't fully remembered. Mark finally looked up, his face streaked with tears, still kneeling beside Bruno. "I didn't think he'd forgive me," he said, barely above a whisper. Maggie found her voice, quiet and reverent. "Some souls just wait for the right moment, and when it comes, they know." She stepped forward slowly, placing the collar gently back into Mark's hands. "Would you like to put it back on him?" she asked. Mark looked at it like it was a holy object. Then he nodded. With trembling fingers, he fastened the collar around Bruno's neck. Carefully, reverently. It fit just as it had years ago, and Bruno stood still for it, letting Mark slip it into place like a crown returning to a king. A warm silence filled the room. It wasn't empty anymore. Bruno had stopped whispering behind the door, because the door had finally opened, and the one person he'd waited for, without hope, without promise, without explanation, had come back. Not perfectly, not promptly, but fully. And Bruno, with a single lick, had welcomed him home. Sunlight filtered through the frosted windows of the shelter, casting golden slants across the hallway floors. It had snowed the night before, but now the white was melting in gentle rivulets, dripping from rooftops and pooling quietly beside the parking lot. Inside, warmth hummed from the vents, and the shelter dogs stirred in their kennels, stretching, yawning, some still curled into tight circles of sleep. But in room 7, things were different. The air felt lighter. Bruno was no longer standing by the door, waiting for a shadow to stop and hesitate. He wasn't staring into the glass with the distant gaze of someone peering into the past. He was curled beside Mark on the thick blanket Maggie had laid out, head resting peacefully on his old friend's leg, eyes half closed, with the comfort of finally arriving. Mark hadn't moved much since the night before. He had insisted on staying, just until the adoption paperwork could be processed. Not because he didn't trust the outcome, but because he simply didn't want to be apart from Bruno again, not even for one night. And Maggie understood. She had barely slept herself. After the reunion, after the tears, after the collar had been fastened once more around Bruno's neck, she had walked outside and stood in the cold for a long while, letting the night air bite her skin. Not to feel pain, but to feel everything. That kind of moment doesn't happen often. A circle closing, a story finishing, a heart, long fractured, mending with a gentle lick and an open door. Now, as she entered the hallway with the morning clipboard in her hand, Maggie felt something shift again. Bruno looked up, ears twitching slightly. Not alert, not anxious, just aware. Mark stirred too, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he smiled faintly. He looked different now, still weathered, still marked by time, but his shoulders had lifted. There was breath in his chest again, life in his voice. "Mornin'," he said with a nod. "Morning," Maggie replied, kneeling down beside them. She reached out and gently scratched behind Bruno's ear. "You ready to go home?" Mark took a deep breath. "Feels strange to even say the word home, but yeah, I think we're ready." The adoption paperwork was simple. Maggie had it ready before sunrise, as if her hands had known what her heart decided last night. No hesitation, No second thoughts. Everything in her moved with certainty, as if this entire reunion had been scripted long before she or anyone else had ever stepped foot in the shelter. She handed Mark the final form to sign. As he scribbled his name across the bottom, a quiet moment passed between them. "I have to ask," he said suddenly, glancing over his shoulder toward the hallway. "Why did he always do that?" Maggie tilted her head. "Do what?" "The sound," Mark said. "The staff told me he used to whine every time someone walked past." She paused, her eyes dropping to the floor for a brief second before lifting again. "He did," she said. "Not loud, barely audible really, like a whisper." Mark waited. Maggie's voice softened. "Because he never stopped believing you were coming back." The words sat there, thick and real. Mark blinked, biting down hard on the emotion rising in his throat. His hand reached instinctively for Bruno's head, which now rested against his boot. "That sounds impossible." "It would have been," Maggie said, "for anyone else, but not for him." She stood up, walked around the counter, and began placing the folder in the file marked Adopted Special Cases. A category rarely used, reserved for the ones who left an imprint on the shelter far deeper than scratches on the walls or paw prints in the snow. Bruno's was the first file in months to go in. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher and the snow continued to melt, Maggie led them to the front door. Mark carried the canvas bag he had brought the day before, now with a new leash, a bag of Bruno's favorite food, and a worn photograph tucked inside. Bruno walked at his side, steps steady, no hesitation in his gait. As they reached the final door, the one that separated the shelter from the rest of the world, Maggie hesitated for just a moment. "I know this might sound silly," she said, looking at Mark, "but could I walk with you just to the edge of the lot?" He smiled. "We'd be honored." She opened the door, and they stepped out together. The air was crisp but kinder now, filled with thawing smells of pine and earth. Each step echoed in her chest, louder than it should have, until they reached the spot near the gate. Bruno paused, looking back for a moment, not at the building, not at the life he was leaving, but at her. And Maggie knew it wasn't a goodbye. It was a thank you. One final glance that said, "You helped me wait. You helped me hold on." Mark knelt beside him again, hand resting on his back. "I still can't believe it," he said. "After everything," he remembered. Maggie nodded, her arms folded to keep out the wind. "They don't forget who they love, not ever." Just then, a young intern from the shelter, new to the team and wide-eyed from everything that had happened, stepped out to watch them go. He looked at Maggie, curious. "So, I guess the whispers are gone now?" Maggie turned to him, then back to the man and the dog walking through the gates together, shoulder to shoulder, soul to soul. "No," she said, her voice quiet, full and certain. "He's been heard and called by name again." The intern didn't speak after that. Some truths didn't need explanations. As Mark and Bruno walked off into the soft light of mid-morning, their figures shrinking against the whitewashed landscape, Maggie stayed at the gate a little longer. The shelter behind her was just a building, but that moment, etched in warmth and silence, was something more. It was a promise fulfilled, and for the first time in years, the hallway outside room 7 held no whispers, only peace, only beginnings. Some stories don't need loud endings, they need only silence, the kind that comes when a soul is finally at peace. Bruno's story is not just about a dog, it's about waiting, with no guarantee. It's about remembering, even when the world forgets. And it's about forgiveness, the kind that doesn't ask for words, only presence. This Pitbull didn't bark. He didn't beg. He just waited, day after day, for something his heart never let go of. And when that someone finally returned, not perfect, not whole, but real, Bruno did what no voice could do. He forgave. With one gentle lick, he said, "You're home." In a time where people rush to move on, to replace, to forget, this dog chose to remember. And maybe that's the lesson. That love, the kind that stays even in silence, is still possible. That even scars can be beautiful when they remind us of where we've been and who waited for us there. At Veil Marks, we share stories not to entertain, but to remind. To remind you that every being, man or dog, has a door they're waiting behind. And maybe, just maybe, someone like you has the power to open it. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe. Help us reach 1,000 souls who still believe in loyalty, memory, and love without condition. Because sometimes the quietest stories echo the loudest truths.